It was always about doing something that mattered, serving my country, and doing it in a cutting edge, unique, fascinating environment with a team that has similar goals and similar passions and similar priorities. I still think it's the coolest job on the planet. If somehow magically NASA called tomorrow and said, hey, this kidney stone thing is no big deal, can you come be an astronaut? I would probably excitedly say yes. Now faith, family, country, career are all intersecting, and it's making my life whole instead of a bunch of stovepipes. But I think the reflective process and the breaking down the barriers process are key elements to give yourself an integrated life that matters and has impact that also provides resilience. And I was just fascinating. And I remember running into my parents every time in our apartment complex that I saw the Concorde, yelling, Concorde, the Concorde, the Concorde. Every day I would see it, and I just got really excited about it. You gain resilience by looking within and looking forward. That if you see every challenge today as a training ground to better prepare you for the next challenge, then you'll handle the next challenge better, and you'll be able to handle the current challenge better as well. When we first took our oath of office together as 17-year-olds to support and defend the Constitution, I took that oath and I was checking out the cute ROTC cadet next to me, not Polly, of course, Melanie, my wife. And now we've been married for coming up on 28 years.
All right, John, thank you for joining me on Embracing the Journey. It's a pleasure to have you with me. My first technical issue in my new studio has just happened with my camera going off, so I guess I've missed my multi-angle. But thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you with me. The first part I really want to go straight into is obviously your call sign. I think one email you signed up on me was best or regards dragon. So can we just go a little bit behind the story at the beginning as to why that's your call sign? Is that something you go by on a day-to-day basis with your family? Is that what your wife calls you, dragon in the kitchen? Give me a little bit of background on that call sign for me.
Yeah, Lee, absolutely. Thanks for having me. And maybe the camera is going out as a bit of a metaphor for resilience in how you deal with the challenges in the midst of this recording. But I am a fighter pilot by background, F-15E, F-22 primarily. And in that community, right when you get to your first operational squadron, they start collecting or gathering stories about stupid things that you did. And after about 6 months of recording those silly things that you did, they have a big ceremony and they give you a name. You have no input in the name. And it normally is based on something stupid you did, but something that sounds cool. Certainly, Dragon is a super cool sounding name. I don't tell the full story, but it has to do with Zaragoza, Spain, and nuclear weapons. And it really was what people called me for the 28 years that I served in the United States Air Force. And it's really a part of my identity, not because of the story or not even because of what comes to your mind when you think of dragons, but just because it was that call sign that is a little bit the initiation into the club of being a fighter pilot. And once you go through that naming ceremony, it means you're a full part of the team. And that was such a significant moment in my life that I'm proud to carry that dragon name forward.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like a little bit of a compliment, right, in terms of getting full-blown status into that and feeling part of the camaraderie of the group. Did that call sign kind of turn into something different for you in terms of did that kind of empower you into a different way, like being called a dragon or whatever it may be? Obviously, has a symbolic idea behind what a dragon is, but did that turn into something else for you, like an alter ego or something in the air, or what do you think over time? Is that just something you identified with?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think the first part of that combination is the fact that you were given it by the team and it means that you're a full-fledged part of the team. I think that's a major part of now my identity is that I am a fighter pilot at my core and I've been accepted into the team now as a young guy, as a part of that squadron. But secondly, it's been something that I've had fun as a part of my branding. And I don't mean branding in this superficial way, but I mean, I just see it as it catches people's attention and I can build off of it. You know, as we're recording now, if I look up on my office wall, there's a large pub sign that my wife gave me for our first Christmas together married, which was 1998, the same year I got my call sign. That's entitled Dragon's Lair, and it's got this big dragon on it. It's a pub sign. We lived in the United Kingdom at the time, RAF Lakenheath, and I've titled a book based on being a dragon. When I was soliciting ideas as a part of innovation campaigns, I called it the Dragon's Lair. And I just think it's something that captures people's attention, and it allows me to parlay something that's good for the group as a part of capturing someone's attention.
Yeah, I have a lot of pictures of my soccer team in my basement, but I haven't called it the Wolf Flare yet. Maybe I'll have to come to that in a second. It def
You
it definitely stuck with me though when you emailed me back at one point and signed it off Dragon and rather than John. And we've only spoke briefly and connected via email. So I found that fascinating that obviously not being part of the military world myself, um, how that kind of shapes your identity and how that moves forward into your life. Does your wife call you Dragon or she call you John or what?
Well, so it's interesting. And when I sent you the email that signed off Dragon, I sometimes catch myself just using Dragon because it's how I identify myself, I guess, because of being a fighter pilot for so long that I don't think about it. And then all of a sudden people are like, hey, what's this dragon thing all about? So my wife was in the military with me at RAF Lakenheath. We got married during my time there, and she was part of the larger organization that I was a part of. And so she actually, about 50% of the time still, calls me Dragon, because when she started as a young lieutenant in that same organization, everyone around her referred to me as Dragon, and it just became another name. And it's interesting because, like you said, I go by John, I go by Dragon. I don't really necessarily intentionally prescribe myself as John or Dragon in any given time. I often, if I don't know you, I go by John because it prevents me from having to explain myself right off the bat. But very quickly, I'll transition into Dragon if I like you, and I guess I like you, Lee.
Well, I appreciate that. It's good to it's good to know the story behind it. Um, so I'm very fascinated these days with the people that I talk to about um, the kind of then versus now in terms of what you believed things would turn out to before you got that call sign, before you kind of went that path, and how life is today, and what the main differences that you've noticed, maybe in yourself, maybe in culture in general. Obviously, we're going through an interesting time right now across the world. So, have you ever thought about then versus now? Is that something you reflect on consistently in terms of what you've experienced, what you thought you would experience, and then kind of your reflection back today?
Lee, I do. And someone told me once that we're all the sum total of what we watch, what we read, what we listen to, and who we spend time around. And so all of us, as we mature and grow, have added accumulated experience based on reading, watching, listening, and spending time around people. But I do know that going way back to some of my earliest memories, I wanted to be a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and an astronaut. In fact, as I'm looking at your recording studio with those pictures and posters behind you, I remember that in my bedroom as a high schooler, I had pictures of fighter planes, specifically the F-15E Strike Eagle, which was the newest plane at the time, and I had pictures of the space shuttle. And it's interesting as you progress through life, and I think we're going to talk about it. Yes, I became a fighter pilot. Yes, I became a test pilot. No, I did not become an astronaut. And as we talk through maybe the course of the next 60 minutes or so, we'll explore some of that and how my life got redirected. But I do think that we all look back on those earlier times and reflect about how two things: we should have appreciated or enjoyed it more, and two, we wish we knew then what we know now. And all of those things are true for me. But I'm excited that as I look back in my life, while there are times where clearly I've taken detours from what I thought I was going to do, I see it all unfolding in a way that I see a plan, I see a purpose, I see an opportunity for impact. And all of those things give me motivation going forward. And maybe specifically relevant to this type of a podcast, I have a practice, Lee, in my life where when something bad happens, really bad happens, milestone moments of badness, that I actually write that date down in my calendar as a recurring reminder. An example is an F-22 crash where a fellow test pilot died, or when I was a group commander and my senior enlisted leader passed away by a heart attack and I had to notify his wife and 2 kids. I have those dates in my calendar and I call them stones of remembrance. And that's a biblical phrase or term from the book of Joshua, whereas they crossed the Jordan River, Joshua told them to take rocks out of the middle of the dried up Jordan River and compile a little bit of a tower, not as an idol, but so that when they lacked faith in the future, they could look back and see how God worked in their lives and how they endured the challenges of 40 years in the desert. And I have that own idea in my life where I have those dates on my calendar. I see them as they pop up annually. And I look back to the past and realize, wow, I remember going through that time and it was brutally difficult. But then I look forward and say, because of that, I saw some good things unfold. And I also realize that I am strong enough to have gone through those tough times, which means the next tough time that comes my way, I will be able to handle whatever happens because I've seen these stones of remembrance and I knew that I endured the challenges of the past.
How long ago did you start that practice?
I think it started when we lost an F-22 and a fellow test pilot. I mentioned that. That was March 25th, 2009. I was the second in command of a squadron. Dave Cooley, was out doing a particular medium risk test point as a test pilot. And because of a variety of factors, ended up crashing and dying in the middle of that test point. And that date and that event was so transformative to our organization and to my life that I wanted to remember it. And I was there for 2 anniversaries of that as the commander of that unit. And I wanted to remember it so the organization would remember it. But then it just became something that I realized was positive because as the days and the months and the years elapsed and we looked back on that horrible event that was gut-wrenching in so many ways, that we realized that we as an organization were much further ahead in our camaraderie as a result of our ability to endure that challenge. And I wanted to remember that truth and created this idea of stones of remembrance from the book of Joshua.
Do you remember how you dealt with challenging situations before? Because that's a traumatic event, right? That's something that really shocks the system, and for the most part will change you a great deal in a lot of different ways. Do you remember before you started that process of the Stones of Remembrance, how you dealt with challenge or hard moments that maybe this would have helped you back then?
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think back specifically to my parents' divorce when I was in college and I didn't have this process. But it's not the process in the moment that is helpful. It is that process that you establish in the moment that gives you the confidence and the resilience and the impetus to be able to know that things will be okay over time. And so as not just during my parents' divorce, but during the years and years that followed that, I didn't necessarily deliberately know that I would be okay. And because I hadn't gone through this process once and then established or instantiated it as a part of my life's battle rhythm, and I just wasn't as good at understanding in the moment of a challenge, based on the experiences of past challenges, that things would be okay over time, and maybe not just okay, but better over time because I am stronger and my friend group or organization is stronger because we went through it and we went through it well and we've emerged better on the other side.
When you were growing up, did you have a big social circle, or were you quite introverted, extroverted? Can you tell me a little bit about what you were like as a I don't know how far you want to go back in terms of whether you're in your teenage years or beyond that. Do you remember kind of what your social circle looked like and what you were like from a person?
Yeah, so I think as a personality, Lee, that I was a pretty interesting mix of extrovert and introvert. In fact, when I do those personality tests now, and I think when I did them then, that it actually is the case that I am weirdly in the middle of all of those indicators, which means I'm not strong one or strong the other. They say that almost everybody is strong one or the other in all of those different metrics. I'm pretty much in the middle, and I don't know what that says about me. But specifically growing up, two things that I remember. Number one, I certainly wasn't the coolest kid. I was the nerdy kid that happened to play tennis and do debate and was pretty smart in school. And I had a good group of friends, but I certainly wasn't the popular guy. But I think that maybe because of my accolades, I was the trusted guy. And there's something I think innately within me that wants to be trusted and wants to be able to make a large scale impact, in part because people trust me. And whether they like me or not, I think that's important. But I don't think then and I don't think now it's at the top of my hierarchy of cares. I want to be valuable. I want to be impactful. I want to be influential. I want to be trusted. And if I'm liked along the way, at least with a core group of people that I like also, then I'm okay with that.
You've said that a couple of times now about being impactful or wanting to make an impact. Um, has that always been there from the earliest days you can remember, like wanting to make a difference, whether it be trusted by somebody or to, you said there about debate, was you somebody who wanted to always win every debate that you went into, or was it a case of always listening to somebody? Were you competitive on the tennis court? You said you played tennis there. What do you think in terms of when you realized you wanted to make a greater impact than maybe just kind of gone through your day to day?
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit, Lee, about why I've used that term already a couple of times. I conceptualize my life based on a mission statement, which is to maximize my impact on people in our great nation. And so I think about impact a lot. Now, going back to my early years, I think that I always saw life, and yes, by the way, I am an ultra type A competitive type of guy, but more competitive with myself than with others, which means that I always want to be better tomorrow than I am today. And I think my perspective in high school was, did I want to win tennis tournaments? Absolutely yes. Did I want to win debate tournaments? Yes. Did I want to ace that test? Absolutely yes. But I wanted to do all of those things so that I could be better prepared in personality and maybe in resume to handle the next challenge and the next challenge and the next challenge. And my hope was and still is that every day that passes, or certainly every year that passes, that now I'm having more impact than what I had before, not because I'm headed in a straight path towards success, and it's not about success, it's about impact, but because I want to invest my life in a way that matters. And to me, that means that I'm making an impact on people and on our great nation.
Yeah, I think the idea of competing with yourself, obviously as a soccer coach, I use that a lot with the players that I work with, is because when you start to compare yourself with other players, that you can get into a spiral of not quite reaching that. But if you have something internal that can drive you, I think it helps you in a lot of different ways. And then I think it can help you in terms of like the process you spoke about, in terms of moving past these difficult moments. You feel more in control when you're not looking around at somebody else, but you're looking internally within yourself. So I think that's an important aspect. Um,
And Lee, I think that not only is what you just said true with respect to handling adversity better when you're looking within yourself, but I think that process of the stones of remembrance also informs us that if you look within yourself and look for the future or towards the future, then now you're more likely to be able to handle whatever the challenges are in the present, because you know that you've got the strength to deal with it. And there is a future out there that will heal wounds and also allow you to turn challenges into opportunities.
Thank you for joining us on Embracing the Journey, Living Beyond Limits, and a huge thank you to John Teichert for joining us for this episode. If you're enjoying it, please like, subscribe, and share. Help us bring these stories to more individuals. So when um, when everything trains you, um, when everything you've trained for meets something that's unexpected, and I've had this conversation with other military members, and I think it was with Paul, um, about kind of steady hand on the tiller, he called it, or small corrections, fly the plane. I think he said through any kind of storm. Um, is that kind of training that you received and I'm going back to the then versus now kind of idea. Um, is that kind of flight training something that you felt you already had, and then kind of going into the military and flying jets or aircraft, kind of you just had the skill set already kind of ingrained in you intrinsically to be able to make these small adjustments in challenging moments?
I think that what you just referenced with respect to Paul, that's Admiral Paul Lanzalota, the commander of Carrier Strike Group 12, currently in the Caribbean, a good friend of mine, a fraternity brother. We go way back to as
I didn't want to
17-year-olds
butcher.
in college.
I didn't want to butcher his title. That's why I just called him Paul, but I should probably call him Rear Admiral Paul Lanzalotti, right?
No, totally good. Paulie is what I actually call him. Like some people call me Dragon, but I like the analogy of steady hand on the tiller. There's something that we learn early on in pilot training that when you have an emergency, the first thing you do is wind the clock. There's a little manual clock in every cockpit I've ever been in. And the idea isn't that winding the clock does something to resolve the emergency, but the idea is that you are likely making emergencies worse if when something happens, you immediately react and try to solve it. 50% of the time, you're probably going to jump in and do something wrong if you haven't thought about it for a couple of seconds. And so the idea of winding the clock is you've got an emergency in your aircraft, there's an engine on fire. What do I do? You don't actually need to physically wind the clock, but before you react, think. And I think the idea of steady hand on the tiller is not just in the cockpit, but in life. When the world seems falling apart around you, then take the time to wind the clock or assess, take a deep breath, come up with a plan of action, and then implement that plan of action. And I think Paulie's concept as an NFO and my concept as a pilot are very similar, probably in part because of our training. But I think there was likely something within us earlier than that that prompted us to have the type of mindset, personality, and skill set such that we understood the need to take a little bit of time before rushing into trying to solve a major problem.
Yeah, I'm interested where that mentality comes from. Kind of an idea behind obviously why this podcast started was how do we develop that type of mentality, which is strong ability to move forward regardless of the conditions. Um, I still don't know if I have that answer in terms of whether it's more genetic disposition, based on environment, based on personal goals. You talked about intrinsic motivation. Do you have any thoughts on where you're we've talked a little bit about your competition with yourself and wanting to make an impact. Have you ever thought about where that kind of drive has come from?
Going back to that pilot training analogy, that a large part of the beginning of pilot training is something that they call stand-ups, where you're sitting in a room with other instructors and your other fellow students, and they, the instructors, lay out a scenario of a unfolding emergency, and then they call your name and they have you stand up, and then you go through what are you going to do about it. And it's a little bit like a red team exercise or a tabletop exercise. And I think the repetition of being at 1G and 0 knots instead of out there flying at 500 knots while pulling 6Gs and talking through under pressure in front of your peers and instructors, what is the challenge or the emergency, and then how are you going to respond? Doing that again and again and again gives you the repetition such that it becomes a skill set that can be trained and learned instead of just being innate. And no matter who you are, the better you're able to get practice thinking through challenges in stressful situations and then implementing a plan of action that is well thought through, the better you'll do with the next one and the next one and the next one. And that goes back a little bit to this perspective that I shared earlier, which is that you gain resilience by looking within and looking forward. That if you see every challenge today as a training ground to better prepare you for the next challenge, then you'll handle the next challenge better and you'll be able to handle the current challenge better as well. And I think that thing that's called stand up and pilot training gave us a lot of repetitions in doing what I just talked about and winding the clock so that you understood stress, you understood how to handle it. And at 1G and 0 knots, before you're actually in a cockpit in the middle of an emergency, going through in your mind and with your team how you handle things is a way to develop that skill set.
Yeah, because it's hard to practice for that eventual situation, right? I mean, I guess you go into simulators or something for the G-force or the vigorous actions that would happen, I would guess. But it is a lot of that just visualization and rehearsing those moments in your mind is, again, I'm fascinated by aviation in general because my body type, I think I would, yeah, I don't think I would survive at those G forces myself. But what is it more visualization than practical application, and you just have to get it right in that moment when it happens?
Lee, I think it's a build up approach. And what I mean by that is you don't just start out on day one in pilot training hopping in a cockpit of an F 15E in combat. You do something far less than that. And that is sitting in this group and doing these stand ups. And then when you get okay at the stand ups, then you go into a simulator, which adds a different, more high fidelity environment, and you go through the same thing. And then you hop in a cockpit, but not of an F 15E, of a basic trainer aircraft with an instructor behind you or to your right. And now you've got a little bit of the backstop where if something goes wrong, it's not as complicated of a machine, and you've got an instructor with you. And then they give you the opportunity occasionally to fly solo. And now you're in this simple machine flying solo. And then you graduate to an F 15E with an instructor, and then an F 15E with crew solo Wizzo, and then combat. And I think it's this build up approach where you don't just start with 1,000 knots and 10 Gs. You start at something far less than that and build up. And I think especially earlier in life, and I'm not discounting that younger people can have major emergencies because they can, but life does get more complicated. It tends to as you go on. That when you're just a single guy or gal, life is easier than when you're married and easier than when you're married and have kids and have a job and people relying on you. And I think it's important, whatever stage of life that you're in, to think about it as here's a chance for me to succeed now, but here's a chance for me to learn now in this progression of challenges so that I can be better prepared to handle the challenges in the future as a part of this build up approach to life.
Yeah, I think that's important because I think even when you're 21, that thing that happens to you in that moment seems like obviously the most important thing, right? We all know that, and you don't feel like you can get over it in that specific phase. But then when you look back when you're 20 years on, and you're like, if I would have handled that differently, my life would have been probably so much more enjoyable in that moment. Um, so yeah, I experienced those kind of moments looking back, thinking I dealt with situations um, irrationally to a point which didn't make sense. Now I'm looking back as to why did I waste so much energy worrying about X, Y, and Z when I could have been enjoying different elements of life at that time. And it kind of goes back to, do you need the experience to, and I think you're kind of telling me kind of your answer to this would be repetition and errors become really important in dealing with situations. If you don't experience them, then you're probably not going to be able to handle them the best. But if you've got, 40 years of experience with it, um, but you also need that support network around you that can tell you that many people have been through this situation and you will come out the right way if you approach it in kind of this kind of calculated method, right? Or just not panic in that moment that things won't turn
I
out.
think I think Lee, that is true from having mentors or this social support network that can lift you up when you fall down. But I think it's incumbent upon people of our older age to role model that not as much by our words as by our actions. And I think being transparent about what's going on in our lives and the adversities that we face, not a total open book, but I noticed as a leader, when I shared a little bit more openly about who I am and my family and some of the challenges, then people didn't just respond well to me. They did. But I think it also provided them some tools in their toolkit to realize that everyone is going through challenges. And if I can watch that guy or that gal endure the challenges well and turn them into opportunities, then that's a demonstration to me that maybe I can do the same. And so I do think the social network is important. I think deliberate mentorship and instruction is important. But I also think role modelship by the way we handle adversity is a way to arm them for their adversity, even though it may seem now to us a little bit trivial what they're going through. It's not, because in the moment, it's a huge deal.
Yeah.
In the moment, what we're going through is a huge deal. And so let's do a good job having empathy and sympathy for one another, but also doing our best to turn those challenges into opportunities by the way we handle what comes our way day to day.
Yeah, and I use a lot of buzzwords, obviously, with a resilience type podcast, right? It's a big buzzword right now, but vulnerability is a big thing right now. Do you think that vulnerability and opening yourself up as a leader leads to what you were seeking in terms of people trusting you more, in terms of adding more value because they can see you for who you are, as opposed to just somebody who is kind of telling them or giving them direction without any kind of connection? How important is vulnerability in terms of leadership, in terms of your mission statement, in terms of your values as an individual or a leader?
Lee, there is an organization in the United States Air Force called Air Force Weapons School. It's the Air Force version of Top Gun. The movie obviously depicts Top Gun brilliantly. In fact, Top Gun is the primary reason why I decided to become a fighter pilot when I watched it as an eighth grade boy in my little small town theater. But this organization, Weapons School in the Air Force, has a three-word motto for their graduates that ultimately become the tactical experts in their weapon system. It is humble, approachable, and credible. And a lot of times as a leader, we really want the people around us to believe that we're credible. We should be credible. But those other two words, being humble and approachable, allow you to learn from others in situations. That's being humble. And approachable means that you put yourself in a position where others can learn from you. And I think it's a vital component of leadership that if you're not approachable, if you're this guy or gal who's perfect, who sits in his ivory tower, who doesn't have problems, who has all the authority because they're the fancy leader or in this position of respect, then that's unattainable for people. And so, why will they listen to me or why will they look to me as a role model if everything is perfect in my life? That's not being approachable. And I think that if you are genuine, something that is lacking in the public sphere these days, if you are approachable, if you're authentic, then it now helps people at all levels and all ages, no matter who they are, realize, hey, I maybe can be that guy or that gal down the road. He's someone I can relate to, which means that he's someone that I should listen to and pay attention to. And I think just by the nature of doing something that is countercultural, which is being a little bit vulnerable, authentic, and intentionally approachable, then now you create greater opportunities for impact and influence, probably in ways that you'll never really know.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. The authenticity piece is something. The more I do these conversations with, that kind of authenticity that comes through is the one that I think provides some of the greatest lessons, because it's the whole idea to share experiences or stories. I think just strengthens my own internal, um, I guess, acknowledgement of things that have happened in my life and that how things have transgressed. And by being more authentic and approachable, I think just helps others around you. I think it helps yourself as well, because you're living true to yourself then, rather than trying to be somebody else, right? I think that's an important aspect of moving forward. Um, I want to move on a little bit because I feel like I could talk to you a lot about leadership and stuff. We'll get to at the end, but and I think you touched on it there about Top Gun, but can we just talk a little bit about where your fascination with becoming an astronaut came from, and obviously your fascination with becoming a pilot or in the military? Where did that all start? I know I think you jumped the gun with Top Gun reference, but yeah, where did that all start? Where's the fascination for air travel come from, or going into space, and how did that look for you?
Lee, I think there are four primary situations in my younger life that I remember that I can trace to this desire to fly and then maybe become an astronaut. It started when I was in preschool just outside of Washington, D.C., and we lived close enough to Dulles Airport that I regularly saw the Concorde come in for landing or leaving on takeoff. And there was just something fascinating about that plane. I didn't even academically know much about it. It just looked different than every other plane. It looked more like a fighter plane than it did a normal passenger plane. And I was just fascinating. And I remember running into my parents every time in our apartment complex that I saw the Concorde, yelling, Concorde, the Concorde, the Concorde. Every day I would see it, and I just got really excited about it. And then we moved to Denver, Colorado, and our house happened to be up on a hill that we could see the planes circling to land at the airport there in Denver as we ate dinner as a kindergartner. And I was just fascinated by these lights in the sky and the way they maneuvered around at night before they came in for landing. And then we moved to the Seattle area when I was in elementary school. And I remember on a field trip as a second grader going to the Boeing Museum in Seattle and seeing all of those planes and starting to learn academically about those planes of all types as the Boeing headquarters was in the Seattle area. And those were the first three that really got my excitement going about aviation. And then, like I said, I lived in this small logging community, Port Angeles, Washington, as a middle schooler and high schooler. And in eighth grade in 1986, Top Gun the movie came out. And I remember in the spring of 1986 going with some friends to watch that movie. And I just got so pumped up watching the movie. I decided then and there, I want to be a fighter pilot. And I did some research at which service had the best airplanes. And the F-15E was just coming out in the United States Air Force, and said, all right, I want to join the Air Force. I want to fly F-15s. And then the ultimate machines are spacecraft. And so it was just a natural extension of, I want to fly these incredible machines that I seen in the air and then at the museum saw in the museum. And not only that, but I want to become a test pilot to be the cutting edge guy flying the most advanced machines. And then the ultimate manifestation of a test pilot is an astronaut flying those incredible machines. And that's the progression that led me to where I went to college, MIT, wanting to study aerospace engineering, going into Air Force ROTC with the intent of going into the Air Force to become a fighter pilot, test pilot, and astronaut.
Now, I don't believe in fate, but if I did, had all those different visions of you seeing planes everywhere you went. It seems pretty much coincidental, or quite very much like fate, right? There's a lot of exposure to airplanes there that I guess play a big part in that.
My mom tells me, Lee, that when I was just a year or two old, when we lived in Alaska, we would drive by the airport there outside of Juneau, and I would point my finger out the window and say, poopy up, people up, poopy up. And I guess that was probably the first sign that maybe I was intrigued by poopies being up or people being up.
So you've moved around quite a lot, right? From DC to Denver to Seattle to see Washington, Alaska. What was the reason for all the movement around the country?
When I was growing up, my dad started in the United States Coast Guard, serving our country in the Coast Guard, and then at some point in there transitioned into working for the National Park Service. And so the military move battle rhythm is moving every year or two. In fact, my oldest daughter, who's a new second lieutenant in the United States Air Force, waiting to go to pilot training, went to 4 different high schools. And so she experienced that same thing at an older age than I did at a younger age when my dad was still in the Coast Guard. And that's why we were bouncing around as much as we did.
How many children do you have?
Three kids.
Three
I've
kids?
got the oldest is a second lieutenant in the Air Force, just graduated from Baylor University and is waiting to go to pilot training.
Okay.
The middle is a senior in college at Texas Christian University and just got a conditional job offer to work for the FBI, which is what she wants to do. And then my son is a freshman at Vanderbilt in Navy ROTC and wants to be a nuclear engineer for the Navy.
Yeah. My family doesn't have a patch on that education and drive. I don't think it's quite impressive. Listen, every father's going to be proud of their children, right? But in terms of them following, I guess, service for the country, which again I haven't thanked you for your service to the country, but um, you must be extremely proud that they followed that path. Was that something that was just natural for them? You don't seem kind of the guy that would pressure your kids into doing anything that they didn't want to necessarily do, but um, just that path must fill you with a lot of pride.
Well, Lee, I haven't mentioned my wife, and so let me just describe because she fits into this picture, of course, too. She and I met as 17-year-olds, starting ROTC together with Paul Lanzalotta, Paulie. And when we first took our oath of office together as 17-year-olds to support and defend the Constitution, I took that oath and I was checking out the cute ROTC cadet next to me, not Paulie, of course, Melanie, my wife. And now we've been married for coming up on 28 years. She has since gotten out of the Air Force. When we started having kids, she got out, but she's a civilian instructor of chemistry at the Naval Academy now. We live outside of DC towards Annapolis. And so I think our kids, as they observed us, they came to the conclusion on their own that there are ways that are important to a life to serve a higher purpose. There's a lot of different ways to serve a higher purpose, but I think there's an innate need for human beings to be part of something that is greater than themselves. And I think they saw this opportunity to serve under that oath of support and defend the Constitution of the United States in different ways, the Navy, the Air Force, and the FBI, as a way to do something with their life that mattered. And they saw it in our lives, my wife and I. And I'm most proud probably of the fact that the way we did it in our lives didn't scare them away. It actually attracted them to it. That I think I'm most proud of that. And of course, I'm proud of their accomplishments, but I'm happy that they are finding or have found a path in life, at least for now, that gives them this tie in to a higher purpose, because I truly believe that's one of two innate human needs that everybody requires in order to fully flourish.
Slightly random question, but was your wife happy to step away from service to raise the family, or was there any kind of friction there in terms of you staying on your path and your wife Melanie raising the family? Was there any? I'm curious as the military household, because a couple of the guests obviously I've had on here. There's a lot of sacrifice from normally the mother of the family, right? Because she's the one obviously has to have the children and go through all that.
No, so great question. And Melody and I, before we got married, had these conversations about what is our family going to look like going forward? What is my goal? What is her goal? How do those intersect? And how are we going to raise a family? And she, in her mind, and based on her understanding of family dynamics, but also based on faith, had already made the decision that when it was time to have kids, she intended to step out of the workplace to raise those kids. The thing that's amazing is that in the midst of all of that, she stepped away from the workplace for a long, long time. She had a very promising career, both in the military or in whatever she did. She has a PhD in chemistry from University of California, Berkeley, after her undergrad in math at MIT. And she kept her resume alive and simmering by working about 40 hours a month remotely. Back when remote wasn't easy, it was dial-up, or it was sending things through the mail and having a lot of phone calls. But she worked with friends from grad school and kept her career simmering so that when the time was right, she could emerge. And I think it's miraculous, and I truly actually think it's a miracle that she has been able to now emerge back into the workplace when our kids were old enough, and is now this professor at the Naval Academy, which has been her dream job all along. And it's in part because she understood that if she did some things during those years that seemed to be career dead years that allowed her career to stay alive, then she could possibly, based on her humble, approachable, incredible nature, emerge back into the workforce in a place that really would indicate that she didn't miss much of a beat.
Yeah, it's impressive because a lot of people stop, right? A lot of people just concentrate on maybe raising a family or doing one thing at a time and not maybe keeping those doors open. Yeah, very
And,
impressive.
and and by the way, I'm not diminishing those people that do that. I love the fact there are people that are committed to making sure that the kids in this community, in this culture, grow up under the strong tutelage of a mom and a dad.
Yeah,
And I think it's important, and I love the fact that my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and I credit a lot of who I am to being raised in that type of environment. But I think that Melanie saw that she wanted to have kids. She wanted them to be raised right under the best possible mentors, which are her and me, but her primarily. And then doing something so that when the time was right, she could make the shift. There are some people that do that shift in different ways, but a little bit of the thing that I think made Melanie also okay with that path is that she was still part of the military community. And we have this affinity. Her dad was in the Air Force, her uncle was in the Air Force, her granddad was in the Army Air Corps, that there is this lineage of service. And being part of that community was important to her. And so while she stepped away from being the active member, she was still part of what we call Team Teichert. And I am really bothered, Lee, when people say at an event as the military member, hey, I just want to thank my family for supporting me as I serve. It's better said, I want to thank my family for serving alongside of me. And I truly believe that Melanie and Summer and Tiffany and Noah weren't there supporting me as I served. We were serving together as Team Teichert. And I think that made her decision easier to step away from being the active member because she still knew that she was part of serving alongside of me as a part of Team Teichert.
it plays a huge part, right? In terms of knowing that you have that support gives you the confidence to concentrate on what you need to do. If there's any kind of hesitation in the background in any family, like that's where things start to maybe unravel and become a lot harder to focus on what you want to do from a career perspective. So I think that that's important. I mean, in the military, it's the time away that you guys spend away from your family is it's amazing to me. Like I used to spend weekends and evenings away on the soccer field, um, but it's nothing compared to months or years all over the world. So it's a remarkable mindset, which I'm fortunate enough for obviously our mutual connection to have met and been able to speak to multiple people in the military community. And you guys do an amazing job at obviously serving the country, protecting the country, and staying really resolute when it can be really, really difficult. I think at times when you spend that much time away from your loved ones. So, um, yeah, I have a huge amount of admiration for everybody that serves in the military.
Well, Lee, it's our privilege. It's certainly my privilege. And you triggered a thought that I think ties into resilience here, which is maybe a springboard off of this concept that I call Team Teichert. Because I think a lot of people look at their lives as stovepipes. I actually am very intentional about writing down priority one to N. What are the priority areas of my life? But those aren't stovepipes. And so I can't look at career as separate from my family. Because if I do, then now I'm going to be trying to balance all of these things at once that you can't really balance. But also, it keeps my family segregated in an unhealthy way from this other major part of my life. And so, Lee, my priorities are faith, family, friends, country, career, ministry opportunities, and miscellaneous relationships in that order. And do I look at life a little bit and how am I doing in those priority areas? Yes, I do. But I also think that a wise man or woman will try to find ways to integrate and interleave their priority areas so that they can service multiples of them at once and their life is a total fit together integrated whole instead of a bunch of stovepipes that sometimes you'll fail, sometimes you'll succeed. You can never balance appropriately. The best you can hope for is to find harmony by integrating those priority areas together, and that helps you build resilience.
You didn't give me enough time to write all those areas down there, so you went a little fast with that one.
I'll go slow. Here we go. Faith, family, friends, country, career, ministry opportunities, and miscellaneous relationships.
No, the reason I say that is because I think I can't remember who I had the conversation with about all these little buckets of things. And there's times in life where you prioritize maybe one, or it needs to shift towards one. Maybe in terms of the stovepipe analogy, I'm quite sure I can visualize a stovepipe right now, but maybe you're stoking the fire in one when it needs it, but you're aware that the others are there and when you need to redirect attention. I don't know whether that's a process that you go through in terms of knowing when you need to stoke the fire more in one area, but because you're still aware of the impact it has in other areas, you can recalibrate to keep everything kind of working and functional. Is that a does that work, or does it have to be like everything aligned together?
I think there's a combination there. One of them is a process that I started in 2006 after a very busy period of being a test pilot early on in the program of the F-22. And I left 3 years doing that job that required flying 6 days a week and being away from my young family a lot. And I went to a 2-year school. And I wanted to put a process in place in my life because I got to the end during those 3 years of a day or a week or a month, and I would look back and say, I was really busy, but what did I accomplish? And I wanted to put a process in place where I could be more intentional about finding this balance that you described of reshifting emphasis areas around to make sure that I'm servicing the things that I care about in my life. And I came up with a process that now every few weeks, after listing out those priority areas that I described and setting goals in each of those priority areas for the next couple of weeks and the next year, I look back and assess, how am I doing? And then by the nature of that iterative cycle, I'm better able to recognize where I am falling short and then adjust my life so I'm better servicing the priorities that I say are my priorities. You know, I think it was Herb Keller, the founder of Southwest Airlines, that said, if you really want to tell someone's priorities, you can look at two things: their calendar and their checkbook. How they spend their time and how they spend their money is actually how you can tell what their priorities are, not what they put on a wall or not what I tell you in the list of 7 priorities, but how am I doing in those priority areas by allocating my resources of time and money to those resources. And I think that process of reflection every few weeks, looking back and say, how am I doing against these priority areas and the goals I've set, give me a better sense of grounding, of finding the right way to harmonize in a integrated life those priority areas. And then the second part is this idea that not looking at life as a stovepipe, but finding opportunities to intersect priorities. An example is this: if I have a military function, or when I had a military function and my kids were little, I was the base commander at Joint Base Andrews, the President's Airfield, or Edwards Air Force Base, this test base in the Mojave Desert that I call the center of the aerospace testing universe. There are events I have to go to, social events I have to go to. Well, if there is this awards dinner I have to go to, I could invite my wife as my date, and sometimes I would, or I could invite one of my daughters as my date, or my son. And now I am there spending time with my family. At the same time, I'm serving my country and doing what is required for my career. And now I'm finding overlap. And by the way, I'm providing a role model to others that I care about my family so much that here's my son Noah as a 6th grade boy that's hanging out with me at the head table of this award ceremony. Or as an example, I'm at work and I see someone who is struggling and I say, hey, I notice something's going on. What can I pray for you about? Now I'm intersecting faith and I'm intersecting my career. And then I, by the way, follow up and do pray. Maybe I go home at dinner and share not by name or the specifics that would be inappropriate, but a burden that a coworker is facing, and we pray together as a family. Now faith, family, country, career are all intersecting, and it's making my life whole instead of a bunch of stovepipes. But I think the reflective process and the breaking down the barriers process are key elements to give yourself an integrated life that matters and has impact, that also provides resilience.
We talked obviously about the influence of the fascination with air travel. I'm still want to understand. So your goal to become an astronaut was not necessarily about space or landing on the moon or traveling to Mars. It was about the machinery, right? The mechanics, the being in charge of something. I remember the word that you used to describe it, like super. I don't know, I can't remember. You have to remind me what the word is that you use for the machinery, super machinery or something along those lines. Tell me a little bit about that journey to become an astronaut, which ultimately obviously didn't happen. And how did you feel, or how did you redirect when maybe that path was blocked out? Was it intentional that that path got blocked out, or was you okay that you didn't? I mean, I don't know if you got onto a space craft at any one occasion. Can you talk to me a little bit about why that didn't work out?
Lee, just to clarify a little bit, it was never about the machine or the amazing super machine. I don't know what I said,
The goal.
but it was always about doing something that mattered, serving my country, and doing it in a cutting edge, unique, fascinating environment with a team that has similar goals and similar passions and similar priorities. And I think the ultimate manifestation of being a fighter pilot is then being a test pilot and testing new fighter planes. And then the ultimate manifestation of being a test pilot is climbing into one of those rockets and being an astronaut. And now you're one of a very few people in human history that are exploring, that are expanding the bounds of what humans can even consider as true in our world and our universe. And so that was always the reason I wanted to be an astronaut. It was the ultimate manifestation of serving my country, doing something challenging, and doing something that mattered with the team. I did want to be an astronaut, and I actually applied for the first time at the beginning of my time at this year-long test pilot school. I actually had it penciled into my calendar that on a particular Saturday, I think it was in January, maybe in February, I would do my application. And I woke up that morning in 2003 and turned on the TV as background noise for doing my NASA application. And that was the day that the Space Shuttle Columbia crashed in 2003. And I kind of paid faint attention to what was going on because I was interested, of course, and heartbroken. But I think it is fascinating that it didn't deter me in the least from filling out that application on that day. In fact, to some extent, it just reinforced why I wanted to do that thing, not because it was dangerous, but because it was cutting edge and it was a unique skill set that is required to be an astronaut. So I put together my application. I thought my application was pretty good. There's a lot of medical questionnaire components to that application. And one of the questions was, have you ever had a kidney stone? I had a kidney stone in 1997. It passed after some lithotripsy in some hospitals down in London. When I was stationed there, it didn't affect my ability to be a fighter pilot or a test pilot. But I got a note back several months later that said that I was permanently disqualified from being an astronaut because I had checked yes and had a single kidney stone in my life. And the reason, I guess, is that when you've had a kidney stone, there's some likelihood greater than 50% that you'll have another one. And on long space missions, their logic is that if you had a kidney stone, you wouldn't be able to come back to Earth immediately, and it would be so debilitating that you couldn't do your job as an astronaut. And so one check of one box about a kidney stone that's the size of a tiny pebble permanently disqualified me from pursuing what I thought was my ultimate dream and the ultimate manifestation of being a fighter pilot and a test pilot. and it certainly was a tough period of time. And I'm sure that you'll have some follow-on questions with respect to how I dealt with that, but I'll leave it to you to ask those questions.
No, I got mentioned this when I was doing something else a couple of months ago about I don't want to always focus on the challenging moment, right? Like I think resilience is also a lot of positive moments in that. But what I find amazing about everybody, again, people closely connected to yourself in terms of Paul Angelotti and Ben Dooley, I did one as well, and Todd Borsick, all parts of the military family. They they all have this very optimistic outlook when something well, in terms of this conversation that we have in this podcast, obviously in the reality of that frame of time that they're going through that I'm assuming it's a difficult moment that you have this one set goal to be on the cutting edge, to be, somebody unique that only a handful of people get to do. You make it seem like the pivot is easy, in terms of you're prepared for those challenges. But I don't know if it's that easy to develop that skill set in terms of I've had one little small checkbox or one kidney stone from many, many years ago can basically destroy my dream of when I had those space shuttle pictures on my wall, as a 7 or 8 year old. Um, so I'm I don't want to go down the road of like, how do you deal with all these challenges and the cliche kind of topics, but I am interested on how you handle something that you've set your whole kind of, I guess, high school, collegiate path to become an astronaut. Filling in the NASA application, I can feel can be quite daunting but exciting at the same time. I can only imagine how long that application may be, and what you were applying for. But when you find out that you can't do that, how long does it take for you to kind of pivot and go past that disappointment?
Lee, a couple of thoughts before I jump into that specific answer. And just to give the audience a sense of where I was postured, I graduated from that test pilot school in December of 2003, went on to go be an F-22 test pilot, which is an amazing job. The guy I replaced, Mash Dutton, went to go be an astronaut. The guy that eventually replaced me in that job, Two Fish Fisher, went to go be an astronaut. So I think part of the context that's important to understand is I was in this pole position to be an astronaut, and that was not the path that God had planned for me. And it happened to be a point where it was before I was a man of faith. And so I didn't think that I handled it very gracefully, or I was particularly resilient at the time, in part because I didn't have this spiritual pillar of resilience to fall back on. But I do remember feeling lost for several months. That this was always my goal. It had always been my goal. By the way, I still think it's the coolest job on the planet. If somehow magically NASA called tomorrow and said, hey, this kidney stone thing is no big deal, can you come be an astronaut? I would probably excitedly say yes, or SpaceX or Blue Origin or someone else that's like that. It's still the coolest job on the planet. One thing that I came to realize after several months of soul searching and feeling lost is that while it's still the coolest job in the world, that maybe there are opportunities that I had just gotten small tastes of prior to that to lead and impact people that can be this goal that is more influential and more satisfying and give me more joy and fulfillment than being an astronaut ever could. Again, coolest job on the planet, no doubt. But clearly it wasn't the path for me. And I think I came to realize, or maybe rationalize, that there is a bright future ahead that can allow me to shape people in service to my country as a leader in ways that I never could if I would have gone down the astronaut route. But I do think that it took several months, Lee, probably in large part because I wasn't a man of faith at the time, in soul searching or trying to figure out what my life is all about, because this major component of everything I had done up to that point was now gone, shattered, and unobtainable.
So, what do you think becoming a man of faith changed in you? Was it just an inner belief that you can move past the difficult moment? What specifically? Because I can't sit here and say I'm a man of faith, or I believe or do not believe in the higher being. I don't. I respect everybody's opinion to believe in what they believe in. Um, so, what does being a man of faith change in you that helped you through that situation or any future situation?
Lee, a few thoughts on that. And the first thought is that I think it's interesting that the United States Air Force, I don't think it's the whole DoD, but the Air Force at least, has something called the 4 pillars of resilience. They are mental, physical, social, and spiritual. And the idea of those pillars is that in the good times in our lives, that you intentionally and deliberately build upon strengthening those pillars so that when your life takes a hit, you have something that is steady to fall back on. And I think it's interesting that even the secular United States Air Force understands that there is a major component to resilience that is spiritual. And they mean by spiritual, yes, maybe a higher power, but also a higher purpose. And I think that as you build up, or your audience members consider what I mentioned with respect to being a man of faith, that even in a secular context, seeing your part in life as a part of something that is far greater than yourself, whether it's a higher power or a higher purpose or a higher set of values, is important to resilience. And I think that I had some elements of the spiritual pillar of resilience established. I just didn't have the faith in a higher power, the God of the Bible. I'm a Christian, that helped me add to that spiritual pillar of resilience at the time. So that's one part of the answer. A second part of the answer is that I actually think that this experience of maybe wandering in the wilderness as I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with my life now that I can't be an astronaut was actually a precipitating factor in me being humble enough to look into the truths of faith and come to the conclusion that I needed to accept the free gift of salvation through Christ, which is my spiritual background. But I think it's interesting that it is actually that journey of wandering in the wilderness that led me to the point where I was humble enough and seeking enough to understand that there was something else out there that I needed to pursue that I hadn't pursued thus far. And then the last answer to that is that, at least according to the dictates of my faith, that everything that happens to us can work together for good. Maybe it's part of God's plan that that bad thing happened and it can lead to something good, or maybe it wasn't part of God's plan, but either way, God can transform it into something that is good. That I think the knowledge of that important truth helps me now as a man of faith to better handle the challenges in life, because I know that this challenge can absolutely, according to the truths of the Bible, lead to something that is good as long as I allow God to work through it.
Can I ask when did you come up with your mission statement, the one we spoke about earlier about maximizing impact on people in our great nation? When did you come up with that mission statement specifically for you?
Lee, I think it was right around the time where I put into place that periodic review of my priorities and goals within those priorities. I'm not 100% sure about that, but that was at the end of 2006. And I think it was coincident with that time in my life where I established that mission statement as a part of listing out deliberately my priorities.
Yeah, I'm interested because the idea of I guess my initial and I think I jumped to the same conclusions when I had the same when I did the podcast with Ben is when we talk about religion or we talk about spiritual, we talk about faith. My mind, I guess, the way that it's developed just jumps to religion or church. But I think what you said there about a higher purpose or making a greater impact, I think that is the spiritual connection that probably I look for in terms of my spirituality is how can I use these conversations to help other people. And I guess that's my spiritual connection. Is my impact is about trying to share these stories with people that maybe need solace in knowing that people have gone through maybe more difficult times or similar times, and what they can create out of it. And I think that first step of being self-aware, and recognizing what value you can bring and what you want to use that to do, whether that's through service through the military, whether that's through volunteering, whether that's through doing a podcast and talking stories, whether it's writing a book. I think that gives you kind of that connection, right? I've had other guests which talk about intuition and listening inward, and obviously deep breathing and stuff. And there is I guess there's a chemical reaction that goes on inside your body when you start to breathe and you start to kind of inwardly think about things, that changes something within your body or your brain patterns that potentially open up other opportunities. And I don't know whether
Lee, I think I mentioned earlier that one of the two things that everyone is looking for in life is being part of something greater than themselves. I think the other one of those two is people want to be cared for or loved. And I think that those pillars of resilience, say specifically in your situation, that you feel compelled to lead this podcast and write what is a brilliant book. I've read it, audience, so please do pick it up when it comes out finally. I think you're doing it because as a soccer coach, you saw the need in younger people to create mechanisms or philosophies or outlooks in their life to be able to overcome the challenges that they face. I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but that's my perspective. And so you've got a podcast, you've written a book, you coach soccer probably for the same reason, because you want to help develop people and allow them to have the tools to endure the challenges of life. I think that is a part of a spiritual pillar. I also think, by the way, that the mental pillar is satisfied by giving particular equipping tools, recipes as described in your book, to help people pull out a recipe and have a practical way that they know about because you've described or instructed them about it to deal with the challenge. And I also think there's a social element of resilience here as well, not just because people are listening or watching or reading, but because you have an alumni network that you've created of people that have been on your podcast that now you can reach out to, we can reach out to you, either to connect to you or to one of your other guests. And I think there's a social element as well. So I think that as you look at just the act of what you are doing now, that to some extent you are helping satisfy spiritual, social, and mental pillars of resilience.
I appreciate that book without me even bringing it up. So I thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Again, I'm conscious of time, and I think we're only on about section 2 of 5 that I'd laid out. So we're going to, I'm really fascinated in terms of your idea on leadership and building trust in organizations. I'm not sure we're going to have enough time to hit on that, as well as kind of talking about your definition of success now. So I just wanted to move on to, obviously you're an author as well. You wrote a book and wrote a children's book. And I guess I've got 2 different phases to that. Is in terms of everything that we've discussed, and I think we've kind of touched on it, but how do you, from everything that you've experienced, learned, obviously your children have been raised in a specific way that has led them to want to serve as well. Through the book that you developed, The Dragon Who Earned His Wing, is that the children's book that you wrote?
It is.
How do you help individuals either through that medium of the book or through the message of the book, which I haven't read? I apologize, I haven't read that one. How do you help them understand the ability to pivot, the ability not to give up? Because not everybody has the same mentality or mindset, which is okay. I not to waffle on about it, but I don't really believe in growth versus fixed mindset. The whole thing that was, kind of burst onto the scene was that maybe over a decade ago. I think there's a lot of in between there. So everybody is unique in their own way. But no matter what their kind of mentality or their belief or their spirituality or their mental thinking, how do you help young people, maybe your children, maybe friends of your children? How do you help them understand how to pivot and not to give up? And I think I asked that question about 5 times over, so I'll have to do some editing on that one.
No,
Well,
Lee, I appreciate that. And you'll be amused at the fact that often during the summertime when my kids were growing up, I would assign them a book to read. And then they would have to read it before, say, we went on a vacation or they couldn't go. I would never stop them from going on vacation, but you know the idea. One of those books was actually Mindset, the Fix the Growth. And we still sometimes, or they more often than not, give me a bad time about some of those books I made them read. And that's one of the ones that actually came up in my middle child's life recently because of something she was going through. And she actually referred back to that book that she read as a young high schooler. I'm not saying it's the end all be all, but I'm just saying in the Teichert household, things are interesting sometimes. And one of the things I get the worst grief about from my family is having them read a book during the summertime as a part of their own development process. So specifically to my book, or how that book is a part of a portfolio of impact to people. The first book I wrote was a leadership and innovation book for probably more established leaders. Boom is the title of the book, Leadership That Breaks Barriers, Challenges Convention, and Ignites Innovation. And that was written based on my experience as the commander of Edwards Air Force Base, that place that I call the Center of the Aerospace Testing Universe, where test pilots in the Air Force are primarily doing the work to test and evaluate all of the different new planes in the Air Force, and how we turn that from a bureaucratic quagmire into an innovation juggernaut. And then I wrote a spiritual book, a 90-day devotional on how to pray for our country and our leaders. But then as I was doing book signings at events, I noticed that people that had one or two books often had a kid's book. And I started to ask them why, and I started to ask myself why. And I think one of the reasons is it just provides another offering that's an avenue for impact, but it really also is an opportunity to expand the portfolio. If you have an idea that is good for adults, maybe there's a way to translate that idea into something that can help younger people, kids, understand some of those concepts at an early age. Interestingly enough, I'm writing a fourth book, which is an American history book that will come out soon. And I think at the end of 2026, I'm going to find a book in the middle between Boom, the adult book on leadership, and The Dragon Who Earned His Wings, the kids' book on leadership, for teenagers or young leaders as they're developing. Because I think that's a niche or a gap that could help me round out the portfolio. But specifically, I wrote the kids' book as, in my mind, a kid's version of what are some leadership or innovation principles I want them to understand at a young age. And I didn't do the illustrations. I had a friend that did the illustrations, and her illustrations were so good. And it quickly caused me to think about the book not as a young kid's leadership or innovation book, but as a grit and resilience book. Because the story is that this dragon, not me dragon, but a physical dragon, found out as he was growing up that his wings wouldn't let him fly like all his friends. And he was heartbroken at that, but he came to the conclusion after talking to some friends and seeing something that he could still fly by joining the Air Force. And now while his wings wouldn't allow him to fly, those planes' wings would allow him to fly. And I think that story is a good one where clearly there was a dead end in his life where he couldn't do something. He couldn't fly. And he discovered through a little bit of soul searching and seeing what was going on around him that there was another way that he could achieve what he always wanted to achieve that he never would have otherwise considered. And that's by joining the Air Force. He ends up saving the day as an Air Force pilot. I'll let the listeners decide if they want to check that out. But I really transformed in my mind the purpose of that book from being a leadership book, which I think was probably something a little too heady for that audience to absorb, to something that was all about grit and resilience. And I love that that message comes through loud and clear based on the words in the story, but also the illustrations that go with that book.
Yeah. So the idea of pivoting, right, is um, one door closes and one opens. All the whole cliches. We should love cliches because they actually have meaning, right? Because people have experienced them living. Um, for somebody in that situation that is hampered by something. So obviously, in your case, it was a kidney stone stopped you from doing it. The dragon can't fly; his wings aren't working, so he finds a device or an aircraft that he can fly. Is there something that you would um, teach your kids in those moments from a reality? Like if they can't, something as simple as they can't figure out something in school. Your kids seem pretty smart, so maybe you didn't have that issue, but can't do a simple math calculation, and they do all the workings and still can't get to the right answer. What are the steps or the processes, maybe on a smaller scale or a bigger scale, that you would advise um, young young children, teenagers, young adults that has helped you?
Lee, I think something we talked about previously is the first step, which is winding the clock. That something goes wrong, I think our natural inclination is just to either immediately try to fix it or immediately get mad about it. And I think the first thing, especially for younger people to do, is hey, let's take a step back and maybe reassess what's going on here. And maybe there's something that I can do differently to use this experience so that I can be better at the next problem, or that I can find a different way to use what I've been doing to actually get the right answer. And so I think the first step is winding the clock. I also think the perspective is interesting that you are learning now based on the struggles that you're going through. And it likely will allow you to be better at the next thing that you're trying to do. You know, in the story, the dragon who earned his wings, not to give it all away, but his wings, not the airplane wings, though he becomes this superstar fighter pilot, but his physical wings actually are the things that save the day at the end, not because they allow him to fly, but because they allow him to do something else that saves the day based on the nature of those wings. And I think it's important for young people to realize that while it's easy to get frustrated or try to jump in and find the solution, taking a little bit of time and assessing the situation and then absorbing the perspective that this challenge truly can provide an opportunity down the road is the type of mindset, not to use that word again, that I think people should embrace at all ages so that they can see what seems in the moment to be an extraordinarily difficult, insurmountable challenge as a stepping stone for positive in the future.
I don't think we've talked necessarily about what you're doing now currently in terms of are you retired from military? Are you still serving? I know you do a bunch of like news outlets and contributions from that perspective. Where are you currently in terms of career, personal?
Yeah, Lee, I'm all over the place. I retired from the Air Force 3 years ago. It's actually kind of funny. My wife said I had 2 years to dabble and then I had to get a real job. I'm in overtime in that, but it's going so well. And she sees that I'm enjoying and having the impact in what I'm doing that she's okay with this indefinitely. But I do a lot of keynote speaking. I do a lot of writing, not just books, but op-eds and commentaries on current topics. I do a lot of media engagements with places like Fox News and News Nation. And then I do some consulting. All of it revolves around leadership, innovation, advanced technology, national security, and international affairs. And so I still think that I'm serving my country. I actually ran for US Senate in this last cycle as well. A big part of the reason why I got out of the military was to try to pursue a more impactful future than I could envision by staying in the military, which is running for Senate or things like that. And so those are the things that I do in this portfolio, and I'm enjoying it. The one thing that I don't get in this stage of my life that I really love is hands-on leadership of large teams. And I'm hopeful that the right door will open up in the future that will allow me to implement that skill set in addition to all of the others that I'm able to implement now in this phase of life.
What are you learning about currently in that field? I guess kind of looking from the outside in to a degree, and being more observant rather than in the middle of things. Are you learning anything different about leadership and growth because the current climate, not just in the United States, but definitely in England, where I'm from, there's a lot of um, trying to use the right words, I guess, but there's a lot of ambiguities. Maybe it's not the right word about what leadership looks like, or how we unify, or how we bring people together, or even we said at the beginning from tennis and debate were like two of your stronger suits back in school. Debate seems to be something that I don't know whether we debate an awful lot anymore. It's like I'm right, you're wrong, and vice versa. Are you anything that you're learning? Obviously, running the U.S. Senate, that's a big part of it. Um, yeah, anything you're learning now in your current role, current climate about the idea of leadership and growth, and what's currently happening in the United States currently?
Lee, the thing that I enjoy most about this phase of life is that I can say whatever I want and write whatever I want with no limits, right? I don't have the Air Force saying you can't go on Lee's podcast
Yeah.
or you can't go on Fox News to talk to Jesse Waters about the strike against Iran or whatever it may be. I can do whatever I want. But there's a responsibility that comes with that, which goes to credibility, where, yeah, I can say or write whatever I want, but everything that I say and everything that I write will be out there forever. And I need to be careful not to fall into a trap that I think a lot of politicians fall into, which is if I say something that is radical or flamboyant, then I'm likely going to get more media interest and I'm going to raise more money. That's a pretty bad, perverse incentive that is causing a lot of the problems in the West, is that people are recognizing that they benefit in the short term by being unreasonable and flamboyant and saying the craziest things. And so I think that has taught me, and an example, by the way, yesterday, I'm not going to give details, but a very highly watched news outlet reached out yesterday to ask me some questions about my perspective on a current news topic. It was clear as they asked me the second question and the third question that they were leading the witness and they wanted me to give a particular answer. And then once I did, they would say, yes, come in our show and there'll be millions of viewers and you'll get all of this attention, but you'll follow up with the type of talking points that we want you to use. I never gave them those talking points, but it was tempting. And I think that the realization that people out there are looking for an alternative to the bombastic, radical, yell at each side from the other side of the aisle. They're looking for genuine. They're looking for reasonable. They're looking for articulate. They're looking for thoughtful. They're looking for authentic. And it's easy to go down the short term road of getting the hits and getting the funds. But it's an important element of leadership stewardship to realize that leaders are always on and what you say and what you write is always out there. And it makes it extra incumbent, in spite of the temptations, for good leaders, the type that can wrestle our countries back to where they belong, to be good stewards of the responsibility and never give in to the temptation that is out there all the time to get the media hits and to get the fundraising by saying something stupid and flamboyant.
Now, I would say we used to classify myself as very pessimistic. These days, I would like to say I'm a lot more optimistic than I used to be. So, regardless of my feelings in the current climate, people can make their own ideas on how I feel or how I don't based on how I answer these questions or ask these questions. Um, I like to think that there's always optimistic times ahead. Um, Obviously, we talked a lot about at the very beginning stones of remembrance and marking dates in time that we can effectively refer and compare back to. Right? It's this is what happened. This is why it happened. This is how we reacted, and this is how we can change it going forward. I would like to think that that process will continue to last the test of time, and that through any rocky period that we may or may not be going through, that there will be light at the end of the tunnel. My football club's motto is "Out of darkness cometh light," um, and my team are currently going through a very, very bad time, bottom of the Premier League right now. We won't talk about football or soccer, um, but I think that's a message that has tested the whole, you know, time scale of the way the planet was formed and all the way through to the ice age and whatever. Um, is there anything that you see in the next generation of uh, leaders, obviously your children, kind of talking about that generation and beyond, that provides that real sense of optimism that this rocky period will be potentially overcome and diversity will turn into unification and beyond? What gives you hope and optimism for the future?
Lee, one of the greatest things that I enjoyed as a senatorial candidate was crisscrossing the state of Maryland. It's about 7 hours east to west, 6.2 million people, trying to get out and talk to as many different types of people as possible. And it definitely was obvious to me that a message of leadership, true leadership, that strives to wrestle us back to where we belong, to solve real problems with real solutions by working together with the other side, was something that resonated with population groups of all types. And I think that observation tells me that we'll get to a critical mass and break through the noise at some point to get back to a productive government that actually is there to help the people, to solve problems, to fulfill their oath, instead of just to raise money and get media attention. I also get hope from, like you said, my kids. I have the benefit of seeing the students of my wife at the Naval Academy. Those are wonderful young people. And I happen to go to a church in DC that's got a lot of congressional staff or young professionals there. And so all of those population groups, they're the ones that are going to replace us. And I see them and I hear them and I know what they are hoping for, which is a government or a society that has far more harmony and unity than it has divisiveness and discord. That I see that they will demand that we don't continue down the same path and they're going to be a part of the solution instead of being part of the problem. And I look forward to seeing that critical mass arise and take back the levers of power so that the perverse incentives can no longer win out and that we can actually strive to bring our communities and our countries back together.
And last question for you. I've missed a lot of my opportunities here for whatever reason. The last question I always ask everybody is if you had to tell your 10-year-old self something today, is there something specific that you would tell him?
Three thoughts here. I hope you don't mind. Number one, I didn't think I did as good of a job as a 20-year-old, maybe not a 10-year-old, but a 20-year-old as I should have, looking up and out and around. It's called, I think, by experts, environmental scanning. I've always been focused, Lee, on down and in and working really hard to be the best. And sometimes I lose the forest for the trees. I've been more intentional about that. Part of the process that I described is a little bit of stepping back, winding the clock, looking up and out. But I would tell my 10-year-old self, I certainly would tell my 20-year-old self to understand your part in the broader picture instead of just digging deep and down in to be an expert of what you're working on. Number two, I love a word that I recently learned, obliquity, which is the idea that you zigzag as you progress. Very few people go from point A to point B in the pathway, a straight pathway that they desire. And it's a little bit like sailing. I do a little bit of sailing with my life. If you're sailing upwind, we're all in life sailing upwind. You don't just point straight ahead. It won't work. The sail doesn't propel you. You do something called tacking, which is you go slightly off wind and it actually creates the lift through the sail that you need to progress forward, and you go back and forth and back and forth. Life is like that. It's obliquity. And we should never expect that we're going to go from point A to point B in a straight line with no deviations. There's always going to be deviations. And the sooner I learn that and your listeners learn that and accept it, the better we'll be able to handle some of the challenges we face. And then number 3, around the time I started doing this priority exercise in 2006, I started keeping a leadership journal so I could learn lessons about leadership. But I also started a blessings journal, which helped me recognize the good things that were going on around me that I consider blessings and can give thanks to the Lord for. But I think it's an important exercise for all of us to do, that there are good things that are going on around us, that while we may focus or fixate on one bad thing, there are so many other good things. And it's a little bit like stones of remembrance, keeping track of them. I never go back and reread those, but it helps keep my mind more positive and optimistic because I'm constantly looking around for things that I can add to my blessings journal, and that helps me recognize the good far more than I would otherwise.
Thank you for watching Embracing the Journey, Living Beyond Limits. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to check out more at www.raisemindset.org or find our podcast on Apple, Spotify or Podbean. Thank you for watching.